Orientalism, Jules.
Thank you very much. So, it's a pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to make some remarks on Orientalizing features in Byzantine historiography, and then I'm going to move on to consider the applicability of Edward Said's original groundbreaking study and how that can work out in a pre-modern context. And then I'm just going to return back to the field and pass comment on what we've achieved so far in Byzantinists and how we can hope to improve on that. So, I am just going to start by reading you out a quote, which I'm treating as an example of high Orientalism in the field. I'm pretty sure that all of us agree that this is an issue which we're facing, but this is just meant to be an example to kind of open your horizons a bit. So, in this court full of eunuchs, women, and idle high dignitaries, there were intrigues incessantly and everywhere, alike in the gymnasium, the barracks of the guards, and the emperor's antechambers. Every man fought for himself and sought to overthrow the reigning favourite, and any means were good, flattery or calumny, bribery or assassination. In the dark corners was prepared the fall of the minister in power, nay, even the fall of the emperor himself. So for those who don't recognise this is Charles Deal. The chapter is called Byzantine Civilization. It's found in the Cambridge Medieval History series from 1923. So to today's critical reader, this passage is probably quite jarring, easily characterised as both misogynistic and more specifically effeminophobic, if that's even a word, and orientalising, of course. This passage is exemplary of the exotic view of the Byzantine Empire, within which the political order of the Byzantine state is seen as characterised as both by a certain dysfunctionality of statecraft, being very prone to dynastic breakdown, assassinations, plotting, and the like, and also on a more essential level, kind of riddled with this effeminacy. So, as I'm speaking to specialists, I only need to sort of gesture towards the inheritance this assessment pulls from in the 1920s. Edward Gibbon has been mentioned a few times, and obviously his characterization of Byzantine Rome as sort of this slide into kind of irrelevance that he doesn't even have to really deal with it. This perspective, I think, on Gibbon's part was very closely informed by his own none too critical, in some cases, reading of Western Christian depictions of the Greeks, to other Enlightenment figures like Voltaire's association of Byzantium with the worst in pernicious superstition, and so on. So I think we're all familiar with this kind of Enlightenment legacy and this great weight of negative associations that had accumulated around Byzantine history and sort of twinned East Rome with the East more generally. In previous talks, I focused especially on how features which are immediately unfamiliar to the author and striking to them, in particular eunuchs, became sort of exemplary of this as an oriental feature of Byzantine culture. But today I'm just going to move on to talk about sort of how this continued on into the mid-20th century. So yeah, these Enlightenment associations of the Byzantine Empire as Oriental resulted in culturally minded Byzantine studies scholars. When they were setting out a grand narrative, normally they would declare that object, the Byzantine Empire, as this sort of admixture of a Hellenic heritage and then Oriental, despotic, mutilating effeminacy, right? So there were these two conflicting features, this cultural contradiction between pagan, the hybridity between Oriental aspects, and this was kind of taken to be the defining struggle which was going on within Byzantine civilization, which is the title of Deal's title there. And then this kind of became especially pronounced in mid-20th century scholarship on iconoclasm, which was often focused around proposing and then rebutting the notion that this was a kind of hardline aspect which appeared in Byzantine church history as a kind of result of a traumatic contact with Islam, obviously iconoclastic, Oriental, and so on. Contemporary scholarship, needless to say, rarely deploys these terms explicitly, but this association of Byzantium with the exotic has left kind of deep-running ruptures, and these obviously extend like well beyond the field. So orientalizing tropes in popular understandings, in English usually the term Byzantine evokes the same kind of labyrinthine bureaucracy, courtly intrigues, and intractably foreign ways of people relating to each other. And to spend a moment talking about academics outside the field, usually I think this sort of otherness, Oriental aspect is used as a pretext to set aside Byzantine material entirely, even from kind of grand sweep works which are claiming to produce a narrative covering everything. So this kind of stereotypical set of associations, Byzantine is decadent, always declining and stagnant, you can find this kind of in all sorts of works which are supposedly from the political left and groundbreaking in their own ways, such as Perry Anderson's Passages of Absolutism and Antiquity, to more recent works like David Graeber, which only deals with Byzantine material extremely fleetingly, but sort of justifies it in these sort of terms. So yeah, these kind of, like lots of grand sweep works reproduce these prejudices in a sort of unchecked way, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So my main attention today isn't just to bemoan the existing state of things, but basically I want to explore how far talking about this as Orientalism can help us out, and then consider what the field has done for the time being. So I've begun this talk with a quote which is coming up to a century old now from a French scholar working for a bastion of Anglophone scholarship, and so I'm going to turn towards Edward Said at this point. So Orientalism is often criticized for its focus on exactly that, on French and English scholars, which Said in turn justifies with a passage which was jumped on by any number of Orientalist reviewers, which is that Britain and France dominated the Eastern Mediterranean from the end of the 17th century onwards, obviously eliding the Ottoman Empire, which sort of, I think, yeah, so I'm going to linger on Said and exactly what his intention was to provide with this work. And I'm going to read you out a pair of quotes which suggest to me this sort of diagnosis, which I find kind of having undeniable value in assessing things. So the first quote is from chapter 1. Orientalism has imposed limits upon thought about the Orient. Even the most imaginative writers of the age were constrained in what they could either experience or say about the Orient. For Orientalism was ultimately a political vision of reality, whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar, Europe, the West, or us, and the strange, the Orient, the East, and them. This vision, in a sense, created and then served the two worlds thus conceived. Orientals lived in their world, we lived in ours. The vision and material reality propped each other up, kept each other going. So the second quote is from chapter 2. Rather than listing all the figures of speech associated with the Orient, its strangeness, its difference, its exotic sensuousness, and so on, we can generalize about them as they were handed down through the Renaissance. They are all declarative and self-evident. The tense they employ is the timeless, eternal. They convey an impression of repetition and strength. They are always symmetrical to and yet diametrically inferior to the European equivalent, which is sometimes specified and sometimes not. So from this view, outlined in those first two chapters, I think we can easily enough conclude that the Byzantine is indeed a tier of the Orient. The exotic sensuousness Said ascribes to the Orientalizing worldview is surely found in lurid accounts such as those I quoted at the beginning. Ambiguously European, at times not, often at political odds with the West, often read as Christendom proper, and troublingly prone to powerful empresses and other dubious forms of political order. It offered an opportunity for subordinating definition applied across the post-Roman world. But having said this, I now want to kind of sound a note of caution about applying Orientalism too rapidly. Said continues, after the second quote I read out, to remark that what's left undone by his monograph is addressing questions including imperialism and culture, and what he describes as the most important concern, which is how scholars could undo the historical damage which he so skillfully identifies. I think that's still something we've got to work on. In other words, the limitations which Said explicitly identifies himself, and which I agree with, in Orientalism, is that it can only be seen as one contribution to a broader project of theorizing imperialism. As this is seen, and this is kind of seen well enough in the ways that political orders of another kind have shaped scholarship focused around the Byzantine Empire and then the associated disciplines. So another word on that. So in our workshop on Balkanism, which some of you will have attended, not all of you, but yeah, I think what this discussion opened up is this obvious point that was conveyed both by our readings and then our discussions and a paper by Alex, which is that kind of like a rich and full engagement with Said directs us towards how in other contexts scholarship itself has been shaped through political orders, national academies, and so on. And in Balkan studies, this kind of thoroughgoing absorption of Said's insights, despite an increasing body of Byzantinist material focusing on Orientalism, I think at this point we haven't yet kind of canonized Said within our teaching, early stage research, and so on, in a fashion which leaves Orientalism's thesis kind of fully operationalized. So at this point, I just want to turn towards the existing approaches within the field, having given my diagnosis, because I think, as I've said, there are efforts underway to correct this sort of essentializing clash of Hellenism and the Orient perspective, but these have been done in a more sort of ad hoc fashion. So there are kind of two rival meta-narratives which appear to inform Byzantine scholars today, which I'll bring to your attention now. So these are very loose categories. So the first is Byzantine as Roman, and the second is Christian Byzantium. And these are very loose because I think to a certain degree many scholars believe in both of them, but I also think there's a certain degree of conflict. So scholars whose work tease out continuities between Romanness and the Byzantine Empire include most notably high-profile polemics from Anthony Kaldelis, the radical Platonism of Nikitas Sinogloslu, to social historical work by Peter Saris, which has sought to demonstrate a continuous form of households as class actors between the 1st century and 10th century. In many cases, the kind of empire of Byzantine Empire comes in for some deconstruction, especially in work by Kaldelis on imperial ideology. And in this way, the kind of conception of despotism in the Oriental is attacked, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. This is a school which has come to a great amount of attention in this decade, but it has much longer roots in the field. One earlier example is Norman H. Baines, who edited the collection the first quote I read out is from. And in the early 20th century, Baines proposed this view of the East Roman Empire as surviving on the basis of continued integrity in military and administrative state. So works with titles such as Byzantium, An Introduction to East Roman Civilization, published in 1948, clearly push forward this kind of Roman, Byzantium as Rome type perspective. So I could spend the rest of my talk talking about this quite gladly, but instead I want to focus on the latter tendency, Christian Byzantium, because this is probably the one I'm most familiar with from my own research training. And this approach by contemporary scholars is also an attempt to reframe the Byzantine Empire away from previous Orientalizing historiographical trends, and also reset popular perceptions. And in this conception, wait, let me just get to the next section. All right. So, this school attempts to foreclose the sort of Hellenic heritage side of things for the most part, or at least sidelines this debate, and seemingly aligns the Byzantine Empire with the Latin West, at least on a cultural, cosmological, and institutional level. And so conceptually it tries to bracket together the Christian world. So this was sort of the perspective which I was taught about in introductory courses at King's College London. It's also a fairly normative position for people to take, where I'm currently based in Vienna. So, yeah, although it's usually unstated in this work, it seems clear to me that there's this kind of effort to, on an exoteric, outgoing level, to try and kind of make Byzantine history seem more familiar, so make Byzantine studies a more easily kind of understandable enterprise. And in contrast to the exotic emphasized by some earlier scholars, Christianity is a more kind of familiar feature for the presumed audience of the scholarship. So presumably one of the end goals in mind here is including like promoting collaborations between specialists across different fields of pre-modern Christian cultures. So again, this is something I've directly benefited from in my own work into monasticism. So the case for identifying Byzantine society as internally defined by distinctively Christian identities and practices, I don't think should be dismissed out of hand. And there's a lot of insights which can be taken by this approach. I think one thing, I was going to list various examples, but I think I'm running low on time. So basically one of the issues at hand is a lot of the surviving material. There's a sort of bias towards stuff which has been processed through Christian institutions in one way or another, or simply is in material culture, originally religious locations. So, so at its best, this framing of Byzantium lends itself firstly to coping with the sporadic survival of material and shedding a new light on its kind of emic contours, while also working within the existing biases and silences. And secondly, there's a means of de-exoticizing our view of Byzantine society and its functioning. So what I'm skeptical about with this one is, and what I'd like to call into question with this appeal to Christendom, is that, this meta-narrative sort of risks two things. Firstly, there's a risk of relegating the Byzantine Empire to the sickly, younger sibling of the West, and secondly, of kind of presupposing commonalities across Christendom, which need to be kind of demonstrated rather than assumed. And the second, and I think the greater risk, is of casting Byzantine culture, including commercial activity, as a sort of intermediary bridging between the true Orient and true Christendom. And Matt has brought to my attention that this is kind of the theme of the event which we're going to speak at in 2021. So this is Byzantium the Bridge. And this is, to me this is very concerning, because there is a point at which this kind of shades over into a notion of the Byzantine Empire as the savior of the West. So the Byzantine Empire resisting this horde, this kind of nihil of the invading Islam. And again, this is something which extends rather far back into the field. Like, we can see basically that perspective in Ostrogorski's 1940 work, The History of the Byzantine State. This is pretty much the account which he offers us. So this is something which has deeper roots than perhaps you might realize at first glance. And I find it quite politically intolerable at this point in time. So so basically I think we need to turn towards Said and other approaches to imperialism, because otherwise we can't really avoid deferring this question of a tier, an Oriental, the Byzantine Empire is this Oriental tier, like the Orient that isn't quite the Orient, So I'd like to side with other speakers today who were seeming to suggest that what we really need to do is appreciate the Byzantine Empire as an imperial force in its own historical context, and only retroactively an extension of the same Orientalizing ideology, which was just as widespread in Byzantine studies in the 19th and early 20th century as it was in other fields of philology and historiography, as Said identifies. So if the Byzantine Empire lasted, it was inescapably through internal dynamics of domination and exploitation, as well as imposition by force and hegemonies, to use a word Nick would like. And then in a historiographical context, it's exactly the conditions of this success and continued survival, which was then deployed by historians from Gibbon to Deal, from eunuchs to reliance on auxiliary fighting forces, and so on, which then appeared as damning evidence of a lesser or conflicting cultural essence. And taking this view, I think that basically what we open up is sort of a problem which is something we've discussed a bit within our network, and that's sort of like, once you start to confront questions around imperialism, you start to open up questions which are like too much for a research network to handle. Which are pretty much that, can we really attempt a wholly neutral or a wholly scientific involvement in questions of imperialism when these are the very contexts which we have been trained and we operate within? Like, imperial domination hasn't gone anywhere as far as I'm concerned. And how are we supposed to side with the forces in our own times and still produce sort of approvable research outputs and so on? So that's kind of something we're going to have to deal with. But to conclude, I think what I'd like to say is basically I don't see Said's Orientalism or any other kind of framework of this kind as providing us with a theoretical silver bullet with which we can rid pre-modern scholarship of its failings, but instead what is pointed towards by it is one elaboration and one set of critical treatments of imperialism. Again, this is not something which our field has none of at the moment. For instance, John Holden's contribution to the dynamics of ancient empire. But I think, again, it's fair to say that like an equivalent examination remains to be done. And one final thing I'd like to close with, one final thing I'd like to close with is that also we have a very different set of global circumstances to those which were present in the 1970s, and we're dealing with a much more sort of conflicted and unclear context, I would say. So throughout Orientalism, Said is constantly deriding the inability of the field of Orientalism to properly explain the rise of anti-colonial movements that were at that point going from strength to strength and attempting regional domination. Regrettably, the movement that Said addresses throughout this magnum opus is still only in a staring state today. Primarily, the global context is defined by the success of the far right. And even in places where movements clearly drawing from decolonial perspectives, as it's now called, not anti-colonial, such as South Africa, we have this very unclear situation where rupturous campaigns are being led by people against parties which were originally brought to power in an anti-colonial context. So this sort of decolonial turn is a very ambiguous one, even at its apogee, and all the more so here in the West. And I could talk a bit more about critics and so on in that song, but clearly, like, we don't really have a global political movement that is kind of forcing our hand in the same way. And for that reason, like, we're going to be operating in quite a different context, even once we do start to do a better job of drawing out networks of solidarity and so on with existing struggles. So yeah, so those committed to anti-imperialism among us, which might not be everyone, but hopefully it's most of us, we find ourselves relying more on patience than on polemic at this point in time. In the meantime, the questions of institutional domination over the field, which have been raised by previous sessions, will continuously arise for us, and I'd like to conclude by suggesting we can't really rely on either evasions or over-reliance on the existing anti-colonial canon. We have to write some more contributions of our own. Thanks.
Thank you. Pretty rousing stuff. Okay. Thank you very much. So we're going to go on, take the same format as before and go on with Alex.
Yeah, I can deliver it from here.
Why don't you just move around and then people can see more. Okay. That's it. Okay, so Alex is postdoc here in Oxford. You all know, I'm sure.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So the idea for the post-colonial turn in medieval studies in Byzantine studies, when I started thinking about this, I really thought about it through Western medievalists and their works in trying to apply a post-colonial turn to their sources. And here, I'd like to kind of outline some of my ideas based on these readings, two of which you have in the readings that we've put on our website. And and then hopefully open up the discussion that will follow after lunch. So, the post-colonial turn in medieval studies, false starts, and new horizons. It seems to me that the starting point for medievalists who have engaged with post-colonialism or applied post-colonial theory to their object of study has often been to apply post-colonial theory and post-colonial methods directly to their sources. Of course, the immediate reaction to this methodology was to raise the question, is this a valid, reasonable, effective methodology for the analysis of sources in medieval history? On the other hand, there has been a marked and ostentatious disavowal of post-colonial theory as a method to analyze medieval history, whether in dealing with sources or as a lens through which to build a total analysis of an object of study. I don't want to discuss any of this. Rather, I want to explore a range of responses to the global and post-colonial turn in medieval history. And I want to further highlight what I see as a central problem within medieval studies, namely the continuing assertion of difference of the Western or European Middle Ages, usually referred to by the shorthand of simply Middle Ages, from the contiguous period for the rest of the world. One of the imperatives stated by Jeffrey Cohen in his introduction to the volume on the post-colonial Middle Ages, now over 10 years old, is to decenter Europe, stating that, and I cite Jeffrey Cohen, "A post-colonial Middle Ages has no frontiers, only heterogeneous borderlands with multiple centers. This reconfigured geography includes Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, not as secondary regions to be judged from a European standard, but as full participants in a world." This is, of course, a laudable assertion and a legitimate concern, but one that is followed in the volume by a series of contributions by Western medievalists on Western medieval topics, excluding not only the majority of the medieval world, but also other academic traditions. Academic output, medieval studies, continues at present to be in a sort of thrall to the two teleologies of the making of Europe and the search for a broader sort of otherness within the remit of the nation state in the making. And this thraldom has important implications for the discipline of medieval studies, both intellectually and on an institutional level. So I want to begin by discussing the review of the post-colonial turn in medieval studies by Simon Gaunt. All of the Western medievalists mentioned in Simon Gaunt's review take an approach founded on a form of Orientalism as the key structuring concept of how a nascent West viewed the rest of the world, particularly the East, or Eurasia. As Gaunt notes, there is a North American bias and overrepresentation in the study of the post-colonial in the Middle Ages, or post-colonialism and the Middle Ages. And most of those who have contributed studies on these topics have come from an English literature background with a secondary focus on medieval English literature specifically. Their ideological positioning is underpinned and increasingly is underpinned by a double commitment to add diversity to the methodological options within their field and to engage more widely with North American debates about racism and ethno-nationalism, which have witnessed the instrumentalization of elements from the Western Middle Ages as evidence of Western European primacy and historical legitimacy. From Gaunt's perspective, the post-colonial turn in Western medieval studies has largely featured a project of using colonialism, post-colonialism, to describe certain aspects of medieval historians' object of study, so looking at England's invasions of Wales and Ireland in colonial terms, but without directly interrogating the basic characteristics of their objects of study, such as might an overemphasis on the Western Middle Ages detract from its utility as a tool to fight Western and white primacy. To this end, borders and the nation are taken as a given, certainly in the work of Patrick Geary. The dichotomy of East-West is a given. Muslim as the place of alterity, or Islam as the place of alterity, difference is taken as an absolute, and medieval is shorthand for the Western Middle Ages. For the most part, Western medieval historians are looking at post-colonialism from within their field. In part, they are doing this to neutralize the instrumentalization of their objects of study for the purposes of white supremacy, and this is a worthy object and one entirely worth pursuing. However, for our purposes, we need to engage with the types of knowledge or regimes of knowledge that these studies produce or reproduce. As Gaunt points out, I'm citing Simon Gaunt here, if post-colonial theory and scholarship has a commitment to destabilize hegemonic identities and to decenter Europe, so the danger here is that post-colonial scholarship on the Middle Ages ends up reifying one of the very categories it should seek to question, or at the very least, to historicize more rigorously, namely nationhood. To better understand how this plays out, let us turn to what has been praised as one of the key historical analyses of pre-modern colonialism and colonialist attitudes within medieval Western Europe. Robert Bartlett's The Making of Europe, Conquest, Colonization, and Cultural Change 950 to 1350, which came out in 1993, so making it one of the first studies. For Bartlett, this nascent Europe, really in this case Western Europe, is an area of deep ethno-religious divisions and open hostilities, acting almost as precursors to 19th century imperialism and 20th century wars. Bartlett traces this by creating a series of oppositions: center, periphery, Latin Christianity, everything else, monotheism, paganism, indigenous settler, active Norman, passive Byzantine, Latin expansion or colonialism versus pagan raiding. Bartlett imposes a certain limit on Europe, which he terms as Romano-Germanic, which excludes the Byzantine Empire and anything within the Byzantine cultural sphere, along with all of the eastern part of the Roman Empire as well as North Africa. The staging of Bartlett's Europe creates a politico-territorial space accompanied by qualifiers such as, and I quote from Bartlett, dynamic Germanic peoples and evasive Byzantine emperors, upon which an ideological and territorial limit is set, and which structures our understanding of the medieval world as one of alterity between the Western medieval world in the East, which here really only includes the Western part of the Muslim world, and the Byzantine Empire for the East. This alterity implies a hierarchy, structures information from within the dynamic colonialist or colonializing west of the Germanic peoples, entirely omitting information about any similar occurrences beyond the circumscribed sphere. In his review of Bartlett, Chris Wickham, writing in the New Left Review, noted the triumphalism in the description of Germanic peoples and their technologies in settling the frontier zone of the European East, while avoiding mention of resident populations and their reckoning with the environment and kind of environmental hazards prior to the Germanic settlements. So additional information for those interested in the subaltern. But why does Bartlett need to produce a series of dichotomies in order to sustain his ideological edifice, i.e. that of a Germanic expansion or colonialism against passive unknown peripheral populations? Is it necessary to create a regime of knowledge that ascribes agency solely to Western Romano-Germanic Europe? What about other expansionist or simply expanding politico-territorial entities such as, well, the Rus or the Mongols? So what is different about them? Does this ordering of the medieval world not obfuscate the diversity of medieval political entities and the dynamics amongst them, and more importantly, render voiceless or passive, immobile, the majority of the world? I don't have answers to these questions. We can think about them. One of the major critiques of a post-colonial approach to medieval texts has been a lack of contextualization or appreciation of the historicity of medieval sources. For example, Western medievalists will discuss the presence of the Orient in Western medieval imaginings. The best example of this is a 14th century cycle that blends King Arthur and Alexander the Great called Perceforest, which has been retroactively implicated in colonialism. Apparently, it was later read as evidence for British mobility and dynamism to justify imperialism. As Gaunt points out, this analysis excludes the text's ideological valence in specific instances and locations of transmission, as well as the possible dissonance between the text's provenance and its subject matter. In this case, the otherness of the Orient is possibly a result of isolation rather than the creation of a regime of knowledge in the 14th century that renders impotent other knowledge produced in and by the Orient. To a large extent, the inability to decenter knowledge away from the centrality of Western European sources and intellectual structuring is a result of the Academy itself. Robert Irwin, in his essay, Real Discourses of Orientalism, pointed out that when Western European scholars in the 19th and early 20th century began, and I'm quoting him here, began to compile the first grammars of the Arabic language, they tended to try to model their works on Latin grammars. Historians who studied the rise and fall of the Abbasid Caliphate tended to model their narratives upon that of Gibbon in his rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The East India Company exams placed stress on the candidate's ability to translate Homer, Herodotus, Cicero, and others. The history of the Roman Empire served as a briefing for the governance of the British Empire. The classical literature of Greece and Rome provided the yardsticks by which all Oriental literatures were judged. Even in the 20th century, R.A. Nicholson sprinkled his Literary History of the Arabs, 1907, with references to Homer, Lucian, Herodotus, and Tacitus. Once again, we turn back to institutions and academies and institutional learning and the way it structures knowledge, creates exclusions, and generates a framework for evaluating historical legitimacy and worth. Anecdotally, I attended a lecture yesterday about representing kinship in early modern Ethiopian manuscripts and art, where the speaker concluded with a comment about how medieval and early modern African art and texts tend to be overlooked, disparaged, and assumed to be entirely foreign by medieval historians of the analogous period working on themes of kingship and its representation on the European continent. Hitherto, the focus of the post-colonial Middle Ages resides within the Western Middle Ages. Two outcomes of the studies studies by Western medievalists on the post-colonial turn have been trying to kind of track medieval attitudes towards minorities. And to this end, there's an excellent book, Race in the Middle Ages by Geraldine Heng, and the representation of minorities in Western medieval sources, along with attributing colonial attitudes to track the expansion of Western medieval politico-territorial entities. On a very superficial level, I see a failure to reckon with the fact that the Western Middle Ages, if we take Middle Ages to be a period of time, are concomitant with other places and peoples who rarely benefit from inclusion in medieval studies programs. And within the remit of my own area of study, early Rus, a series of scholarly studies have been produced by American colleagues who attempt to either insert Rus into the Western Middle Ages by demonstrating perceived similarities, sort of forcing Rus to comply with the cultural and political idioms of Western medieval kingdoms to the exclusion of Byzantine and steppe influences. Other studies, for example, bemoan the intellectual silence of Rus for not having produced an Abelard or having discovered Greek philosophy. And I mean, this is case in point. The Euro-Byzantium and the Intellectual Silence of Rus Culture by one Don Ostrovsky of Harvard University. This came out this year, so 2019. To this end, I welcome the global Middle Ages approach that at least expands the boundaries of what counts as medieval history. To this end, Byzantine studies has had some success because of its breadth, both in terms of its political and cultural reach, incorporating large portions of the Eurasian continent, Europe, and North and East Africa. These connections and the cultural cohesion of production and forms, both rising out of the Greek and Roman cultural sphere, but also out of religious entanglements and the role of Eastern Christianity in the types of textual production, book learning, and artistic architectural expression extant over a large landmass, possibly allow for wide-reaching dialogues and intellectual connections to form, even if this hasn't always happened. However, none of this has obviated also the rise of nationalism and claims to a Byzantine heritage by several nation-states and empires as well, which has been an unhappy result of Eastern Christianity as a structuring element in national identity. And this is where I'm sort of concluding, the rise of nationalisms in the sphere of the post-Byzantine space, following intervening events and political organizations, has a direct bearing on how we are able to talk about and engage with our objects of study. The nations that some of us reckon with have often employed medieval topoi as forms of potentially common identifications in terms of race, religion, language, culture, history, land. After all, the Middle Ages have been a wellspring for nationalist myth-making, and the revival of popular interest in the Middle Ages has, at least in the last 2 centuries, accompanied nation-building projects based on teleological trajectories and the symbolism of primordial identities and traditions. The case of the myth of Kosovo, for example, is especially useful here, as it includes all of the features of myth history, dehistoricization, decontextualization, attendant symbolic landscape and reference, titanization, and spiritual elevation. The myth of Kosovo has been characterized by Marko Živković as a pristine myth because of its polysemic quality, the potential for it to be applied to any set of circumstances, events, as well as its ability to transcend space-time. Here, in the case of the Serbian nation-state, the Byzantine period serves as a primordial moment of national cohesion, both ethnic and territorial, subsequently disrupted by several centuries, for example, by the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Socialist Yugoslavia, and most recently, the EU and NATO. Within the theme of nationalism and nation, we could really gain a solid footing in thinking about a post-colonial turn in Byzantine studies. For example, we could discuss the shaping of information about historical places in terms of center periphery, or by taking borders as a historical given. And here I cite Robert Young, the post-colonial or the post-imperial nation in terms of its fragments, those parts and those peoples who do not easily belong to it, who exist at the margin and peripheries of society. They are the means through which the nation relates to itself. So the modern system of walls, borders, boundaries often looks to medieval history to legitimize these boundaries. Here, the use of medieval sources and pre-modern borders becomes part of an ideological system that justifies the existence of borders and boundaries. And yet, it can be quite the opposite. Medieval sources are forgotten, such as North Africa, which is othered, i.e. it is emphatically non-European, and a system of extreme security accompanied by fences and radar is currently used to keep people from crossing to Spain via Ceuta and Melilla. There are a variety of ways in which to attempt a post-colonial turn in medieval history more broadly by looking at situations, discourses, and phenomena we now identify as colonial or indeed post-colonial. We, of course, need to remain attentive to the varying dynamics that existed in the modern and pre-modern worlds. Even Gaunt ends on an optimistic note here, stating, post-colonial medieval studies are thus opening up for us fields of inquiry into which we have yet fully to venture, territories populated by unfamiliar medieval peoples, languages, and cultures of many different stripes. For me, a post-colonial turn in Byzantine studies would not only deploy post-colonial analysis and methodology to the study of sources, but would critically and self-reflexively engage with the way we situate our field within history, or more broadly within the humanities, and the regimes of knowledge that we produce or reproduce by shaping and treating information in specific ways. An ideal result would be the interrogation of the sites of knowledge production, both contemporary and historic, and the types of knowledge they produce, their ideology, or just simply system or set of ideas. I think that we have already broached some of this during our first webinar on Balkanisms, and we continue to broach this today. Furthermore, I'm entirely aware of the limitations of our approach to fomenting a post-colonial turn in Byzantine studies. The dissection or deconstruction of how medieval identities are invented, hybrid, fluid, and negotiated can reduce the complex phenomena of institutional and state power that acts on our fields to discourses, reducing them to discourses and representations, forgetting that discourses and representations have material power. To cite the African post-colonial theorist Achille Mbembe, and I cite him, helped by the collapse of Marxism as an analytical tool and an all-embracing project, and by the demise of theories of dependency, economic explanations of contemporary social and political phenomena have, with consideration of the draconian character of external constraints, all but disappeared. All struggles have become struggles of representation. Levies, exploitation, taxes, tribute, and coercion no longer exist. For me, one important element of a post-colonial turn in Byzantine studies would be the multiplication of sites of knowledge production and the formal inclusion of global colleagues. I mean this as an internationalism, implying a political combat for the inclusion of colleagues who are barred from countries in the global north, either by something like Trump's Muslim ban or Theresa May's hostile environment, and from whose countries we might be barred due to border regimes of nation-states. This combat is one that includes, on an institutional level, the diversification of the sites of the production of knowledge within our field that is aware of the historico-political conditions of the emergence of our field, that actively combats class exclusion, exclusivity, broader combat against the capitalist university, that positions our field within the broad realm of medieval history, and that in turn actively agitates for the inclusion of other areas of medieval historical study, and one that destabilizes the central position of the European Middle Ages and medieval history itself as monoliths. Thank you.
Okay. Well, there's so much in those two papers, so I don't want to hold up any discussion, but just throw in two things.